Welcome back. New York Congressman Max Rose is a combat veteran who's helping first responders on the front lines of the war against the coronavirus by working with National Guard to build an emergency coronavirus hospital in Staten Island. He joins us now with his strategy for winning this battle. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being here, Congressman. We're just thrilled to have you. Tell me, why did you want to deploy with the National Guard, and what did you learn from this experience?
Well, thanks so much for having me, all of you. I'm a huge fan, as is my entire family. Look, anything that I just did over the last 2 weeks, while it was an incredible privilege, is nothing compared to the incredible service that I saw. You all spoke about in your last segment, searching for optimism in this day and age. Well, I'll tell you, you can find it right out there on the front lines. You know, I served alongside doctors who, had lost family, whose family was sick, and they were still soldiering on. Nurses who hadn't had the opportunity to hug their children in weeks, if not more than a month. And I remember on the last huddle before we saw the first patient at this COVID-only facility that this extraordinary team had built and established in less than a week, that you saw the soldiers in their own uniform, many of whom had deployed more than a few times, applauded the first-line medical professionals. These are the soldiers in this new war, and just that moment, where people aren't thinking about political differences, they're not thinking about divides, they're just getting the job done. That gives you all the faith that you need in this country that we're going to beat this virus.
So what do you say to your fellow Congress folks with the military experience? You think they'll follow your lead and help to keep this jubilance going?
Well, I'll tell you what I am advocating for, and I'm certainly not the only one. This is an operational problem at this point, and there's a clear role that the federal government has got to play, as well as a clear role for states and cities. But there are certain things that only the federal government can get done, and with presidential leadership, and that's centered around production of these critical supplies that we need. The PPE to protect our medical professionals, the reagents, the lab equipment, the swabs. We need millions upon millions of these items so we can ramp up testing, ramp up antibody testing, do the contact tracing, so we can open up this economy, albeit gradually, because it's true, people are suffering economically. And we have got to work our hardest to allow for people to get back out there safely, albeit, and start providing for their families again, and make sure that we have the hospital-based infrastructure behind them, so that we can continue to aid the sick as well as protect those who are the most vulnerable.
Congressman, this is Megan. First of all, thank you for your service in our military and all that you're doing right now. We're all very grateful. You are an Army veteran with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Stars. You served in Afghanistan, and you recently said that you agree with President Trump comparing this virus to a war. So how do you think it compares, and should that inform our response?
It absolutely should inform our response, and in many ways, it's more analogous with World War II than it is even with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, not to ever reduce the incredible sacrifices that our soldiers made in the 21st century. But in World War II, it was more of an instance of total war, where we had to utilize the full manufacturing capacity of the United States. And this requires the president to step in, assert all of the powers underlying the Defense Production Act, as he did in the Korean War, for instance, to make sure that there's no shortage of these critical supplies that we need. And there's a lot of complexity around this, but it does boil down to the simple fact that the free market alone won't solve this problem. That many companies who make all of these critical supplies are saying, well, I don't know if I'm going to build that second factory or that third factory because I don't know if this demand will be there a year from now. The federal government can step in and guarantee purchases for several years to come. Worst case is that those purchases go towards a reserve. It's things like that. But there's another element of war that I think is even more important right now, and that is the solidarity that comes during a wartime, where people are not thinking about ways to divide each other, but they're thinking about ways in which we can unite. That's what makes this the greatest country in the history of the world. It's how we sent a man to the moon. It's how we won World War II, won the Cold War, and it's how we're going to beat this. And I have more confidence than ever that we can get that done.
Now, Congressman, you've said nothing would make you happier than seeing the president be successful in beating COVID-19, even if it means him winning re-election. What does the president need to do right now that he has not done?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just speak to the larger politics of this. After Barack Obama won his first election, Mitch McConnell stood up and said his singular priority is to make sure that this president doesn't win re-election. I'm never going to stoop down to that level. During every moment of significant crisis in this country, it has required presidential leadership. We all know that the president has to step up and utilize the full powers available to him as commander-in-chief. He asserted the Defense Production Act yesterday for swabs. I think that is exactly the type of thing that we need to see more of. And we can't think about politics right now. We can't think about an election. We have to just think about the future of this country and beating this virus. We need to dramatically expand testing to the point where we're doing millions of tests per day for both antibodies and the virus. We need to have significantly expanded hospital infrastructures in place in the event of a second surge. Let's not forget, in the history of pandemics, it's often the second surge, which is even more severe than the first. And then lastly, we have to think about how are we going to protect those people who we're now calling essential workers. They were always essential. The cops and firemen and teachers and nurses and people working in supermarkets and the transit workers, so many of whom live in my district. Thought. We've got to be there for them.
Hold that thought, Congressman. We'll talk more when we come back. We are back with Congressman Max Rose. Hey, Joy.
So, Congressman, it's Joy, yes. Trump has been tweeting that states should be liberated from stay-at-home orders. I do that because liberated is not the correct word to use here, but that's what he's using. And now we're seeing angry protests pop up all across the country that violate basically social distance orders. Don't you think, or do you think, Trump is sending a dangerous message to the American people?
Of course, it's a very dangerous message. Here's what's fascinating about this situation. I agree with President Trump's statements from a week ago or so, when he said this is up to the states to determine on a regional basis how they gradually open up their economies. We can't just have one set uniform policy for the entire country because there's areas that can be opened up, albeit gradually and safely, quicker than others. I don't agree with President Trump's statements from yesterday and the day prior, where he's advocating for people to openly flaunt the laws and executive orders of their own governors to, in essence, break the law. We're in this together. If we've seen in New York, the only way that we can truly bend the curve, flatten the curve, is by changing social distancing behaviors. That's not going to change going forward. It will just become more relaxed. But we're not going to be out of the woods for some time, especially until there's a vaccine. And we need the president to lead in this regard. And I don't think Twitter is necessarily the way in which he could be accomplishing that, especially when he's advocating for things like this.
Congressman, this is Megan again. So we have been seeing reports that China obviously has not been transparent with the rest of the world, suppressing information from the beginning when they knew how deadly this disease is. I'm absolutely furious. I think for the benefit of our country, we should have as little to do with the Chinese government as possible. Do you think that the U.S. and the world should hold them responsible for the gravity of this pandemic and the fact that if we had possibly had more of a heads up, maybe less people would have tragically died?
So it's a phenomenal point. And let me say this, when it comes to our larger relationship with China, I led one of the few bills this term which has successfully put sanctions on China. In this instance, it was putting sanctions on Chinese pharmaceutical companies for producing fentanyl, which is killing our kids each and every day. It's clear that China has not been honest about their numbers. It's clear that they could have done far more, and it's becoming increasingly more likely that they're not being honest about the sources of this deadly virus originating and spreading throughout the world. But with that being said, we cannot let our criticisms of China bleed into rampant xenophobia and bias towards Chinese Americans and violence towards Chinese Americans. That is happening at scary, scary levels, and they are Americans and patriots just like all of us and your viewers. The other thing that we can't do right now is just completely retreat away from the world and be isolationists. The World Health Organization made some egregious mistakes, but that's cause for us to take even more of a leadership role, reform the institution. If we isolate, we will forget about the fact, to our own chagrin and demise, that this is a global problem. This virus doesn't see borders. It doesn't see race, creed, socioeconomic status, religion, or nationality, and we have to have a global solution.
I have to say thank you, Congressman. Come hang with us anytime, okay?
I would love
We'll be right
that.
back.